My name is and today I just start a lecture on respiratory physiology because in my previous lecture I talked about respiratory anatomy, its basic structure. So today I just would like to start respiratory physiology because it's also a part of respiratory medicine. So if you know the physiology, anatomy, so you easily diagnose any condition in patient. So now let's talk about the respiratory physiology. So before talking about physiology, I just would like to mention few points, just review little bit anatomy. Like our respiratory center, respiratory system contain nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and lungs. So this is a brief introduction of respiratory anatomy that we already discussed in my previous lecture. I already talked about this. Now let's start about the basic physiology. So respiratory physiology is a complex coordinating process that help to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis means what? To maintain the oxygen, carbon dioxide level, maintain the oxygenation, deoxygenation level in the blood. So this is how our respiratory system maintain our body homeostasis. So respiratory function includes the following things. There is external respiration, then there is the external respiration, there is a pulmonary ventilation that we call breathing, then pulmonary gas exchange, then transport of gases by blood, that how blood transports the gas from lungs to the tissue. Then there is the internal respiration, how the systemic tissue gas exchange, cellular respiration, regulation of respiration. Then we will talk about what's the controlling center of respiratory system in the brain. Let's start about from the basic thing. This is the alveoli. This is a pulmonary ventilation alveoli, and this is a gases exchange that happen. This is we call pulmonary ventilation. That how gases, how oxygen come into the alveoli, and how carbon dioxide leave the blood into the alveoli. This process between the alveoli and blood we call gases exchanges. And this process, the connection between the alveoli and the external environment, it is we call pulmonary ventilation. And there is a word we call alveolar ventilation, that how the alveoli gas exchange take place between environment and alveoli, how oxygen come into the alveoli and how carbon dioxide leave the alveoli. This is the alveolar ventilation, and then we call, you can say, pulmonary ventilation. And this is the gases exchanges, and this is the mechanism that how tissue take the oxygen and how tissue cellular respiration release the carbon dioxide. And this is the brain, and that how this brain center, this we will talk about at the end of this lecture. Just you just shortly just know about this, that this is the brain, and brain, this is the brain stem, and in the brain stem this is a medulla pons that control the respiration. And this is a carotid sinus, that this can maintain the oxygen and carbon dioxide level. So this is the how in our neck region there is a, in the baroreceptors, and in the here there is a aortic receptors, and through these receptors oxygen and carbon dioxide level maintain the body. Okay, baroreceptor mean what? This is a chemoreceptor. The baroreceptor mean what? Just to maintain the blood pressure. The baroreceptor mostly common in where? In your neck region, in the carotid sinus. But in the aortic, there's the chemoreceptors that maintain the chemical level in the oxygen and carbon dioxide level. Okay. Now talk about the pulmonary ventilation. So pulmonary ventilation, what's the meaning of pulmonary ventilation? That pulmonary ventilation contains respiratory cycle, ventilation or breathing. So respiratory cycle include two things: inspiration and expiration. Inspiration means moves air into the lungs, and expiration means moves air out of the lung. This is the respiratory cycle. Like in the cardiac cycle, there is a contain eight cycles: systole, diastole, mid-diastole, and systole. That's how the respiratory cycle. This is also a respiratory cycle: inspiration and expiration. So what's the mechanism of pulmonary ventilation? That how the ventilation happen. First of all, you should know how the ventilation happen. So pulmonary ventilation mechanism must establish two gases pressure gradient. What's the meaning of this thing? It means that when the pressure within the alveoli is less, then there is an inspiration is produced. Because when alveoli pressure less and atmospheric pressure is more, then you will take oxygen, you take inspiratory efforts. But if the this is the inspiration, okay, so alveolar pressure must be lower than atmospheric pressure in the external environment, then you produce inspiration. But if there is alveoli pressure is more than the atmospheric pressure, so you will produce what? Expiration. So this is how the ventilation goes on, how normal physiology going on. Then pressure gradient are established by changes in the size of thoracic cavity that are produced by contraction and relaxation of muscle. That's very important line, that how the pulmonary ventilation happen. Because if the size of thoracic cavity is changed due to contraction and relaxation of muscle like intercostal muscle, external intercostal muscles, diaphragm, when that change, that contract, that relax, that these muscle when contracts and relax, then ventilation happen. But without this contraction, ventilation will never happen. So if any weakness of these muscles, if any pathology in the thoracic cavity, if there is no contraction, like in the myasthenia gravis, there is a pathology of muscle, that muscle not contract because acetylcholine is not working well. So no contraction. So you think ventilation happen? So pulmonary ventilation, this contraction and relaxation helps pulmonary ventilation. And then there is a Boyle's law. The volume of gas varies inversely with the pressure at constant temperature. So when pressure changes, so gas exchanges. Now, what's the pulmonary ventilation mechanism? Before, in the last slide, I just talked about inspiration and expiration. Now, I will talk about in a detail that how the mechanism of pulmonary ventilation happens. So, what's first of all inspiration? So, how inspiration occurs? So inspiration occur due to the contraction of diaphragm produce inspiration, because when diaphragm contraction, so normally diaphragm is a dome shape. When it contract, it become like a horizontal shape or it's not like a dome shape. So when it's contract, it makes thoracic cavity larger. So this is the purpose for diaphragm contraction. So when there is no diaphragm contraction, no increased thoracic cavity larging. So when there is a contraction of diaphragm become flat, lungs become expand, thoracic cavity expand, pleura, visceral pleura and parietal pleura gap become less, pressure between parietal pleura and visceral pleura become less, then inspiration happen. So this is a thing that stretching of the muscles of intercostal muscles and contraction of the diaphragm produce inspiration. The expansion of thoracic result in decreased intrapleural pressure. Intrapleural pressure between visceral pleura and parietal pleura. When between visceral pleura and parietal pleura, pressure decrease leads to the decreased alveolar pressure. When alveolar, when these pressure decreases, alveolar pressure decrease. When alveolar pressure decrease, inspiration happen. Okay, so this is very important thing you should know. So how this happen? Due to the how this expansion of thoracic happen? Due to the contraction of diaphragm as well as intercostal muscle, and then air moves into the lungs when alveolar pressure drop below the atmospheric pressure. That I already mentioned in my first PPT, that when the alveolar pressure become less, then the atmospheric pressure, then air moves into the lungs. What's the complaints? Complaints mean that ability of the pulmonary tissue to stretch makes inspiration possible. Here, here is the important point, that outside the alveoli there are some elastic tissues. Elastic tissue, there is a elastase, anti-elastase. So there is a elastic tissues. So elastic tissues around the alveoli. When these elastic tissues stretch, alveoli stretch, and alveoli stretch, so inspiration happens. There is a pathology we call uh, because in the different pathologies, as in bronchitis or in your lung complaints, in the COPD patient and atelectasis in some lungs pathology, in which what happens, there is a, you can say that there is a elastic tissue become less. When elastic tissue become less, there is no alveolar inflation happen. When there is no alveolar inflation happen, there is no inspiration. So this is very important, that elastic tissue plays a very important role because it is present outside the alveoli, wall of alveoli. So smoking can destroy this elastic tissue. When elastic tissue destroyed, there is no complaint, there is no proper inspiratory effort. There is a elastase enzyme. When elastase become more, anti-elastase less, they can also, there is a disease we call antitrypsin deficiency, in which what happens, your antitrypsin become less, so and also anti-elastase become less. But when they become less, so elastase activity more, so they break down the elastase tissues. Now I talk about the expiration. So what's the mechanism of expiration? Normally inspiration is an active process and expiration is a passive process. So that begins when inspiratory muscles are relaxed. So when inspiratory muscles relax, then there is a decreased size of thoracic, and then there is a expiration happen. So increasing thoracic volume increases intrapleural pressure and thus increasing alveolar pressure above atmospheric pressure. When alveolar pressure more than atmospheric pressure, then expiration happens. This is happen how? Because when increasing thoracic pressure, when thoracic pressure become increased, and that increases intrapleural pressure, that intrapleural pressure between the parietal and visceral pleura, that causes increases alveolar pressure. So these two things increases alveolar pressure. That pressure can induce what? Expiration. So when there is no increasing thoracic volume, when there is no increasing thoracic volume, there is no increasing blood pressure. So this is happen. So then air moves out of lungs when air pressure exceeds the atmospheric pressure. And what's the pressure between? The pressure between parietal and visceral pleura is always less than the alveolar pressure and less than the atmospheric pressure. So this is the thing, that parietal pleura and visceral pleura is always less than the alveolar pressure as well as atmospheric pressure. So what's the elastic recoil? Elastic recoil is that the tendency of pulmonary tissue to return to a smaller size after having been stretched passively during expiration. So there is a elastic recoil tissue because alveoli, outside the alveoli, there is elastic tissues that when you contract, they stretch, and when expiration happen, so relax, so that elastic tissue become relaxed. And also your ribs, your costocartilage, your muscles also act as a elastic recoils. So when the elastic tissues that around the alveoli, when they stretch, then stretch during when and inspiration, then again elastic recoil, then they come over to its original position. This is we call recoil. Okay, so this is due to pulmonary tissue which around the alveoli. Now I am talking about this is the normal respiratory cycle, that how inspiration expand the lungs and diaphragm become horizontal shape. Secondly, how it maintain its pressure. Then how expiration happen. Here you see diaphragm become horizontal shape, and here diaphragm become normal down shape. And here is now part of the respiratory cycle is completed. Now I'm talking about the pulmonary ventilation. So what is a pulmonary ventilation? So pulmonary ventilation means the in which we talk about the pulmonary capacity, the sum of two or more pulmonary volume. What's the vital capacity? So vital capacity is the inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume. What's the inspiratory reserve volume? It is the extra volume of air that can be inspired forcefully. When you forcefully inspire the air, one is a normal that normally you take the inspiration and expiration. This is a normal. But when you forcefully inspire, if someone asks you that, okay, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath means long inspiration. So this is because when extra volume of air that can be inspired forcefully beyond the normal volume. Normal tidal volume in but 500 ml. When you more than this, it's called inspired reserve volume. What's the tidal volume? That normally you inspire the normally in taking in the resting position you are taking on when you are doing an exercise, so maybe you are doing inspiratory reserve volume. So when you are doing in the normal sitting position, when you are taking tidal volume normally in 1 minute, so you will take how much? That normally you take the inspired there, that is 500 ml. And expiratory reserve volume mean what? When you forcefully expired the air, expel the air after expiratory reserve volume. Okay, or after normal tidal. When after normal tidal volume, for example, in the sitting position, normally resting position, you are inspiring the air normally 5 minutes. Then expiry reserve volume when you forcefully expire the air, like in the spirometry test or in the peak expiratory flow meter, when you blow the air in the flow meter. So it means you are doing what? Expiratory reserve volume. And there is a minimal volume. So this vital capacity includes these three. A minimal volume, but amount of air remaining after residual volume. Residual volume is what? That when you forceful residual volume means what? When you forcefully expire the air. When you forcefully expire the air and the remaining air that will never leave the lungs because some air must be remain in the lungs. So when you forcefully expire the air and the amount of air that can never be expelled from the lungs, we call residual volume. So a person's vital capacity depends on the many factors, including the size of thoracic cavity and posture. When thoracic cavity due to any pathology, thoracic cavity becomes disturbed like in the spondylosis, ankylosing spondylitis, scoliosis. Your spine shape becomes disturbed. When spine shape becomes disturbed, when, when, when spine shape becomes disturbed, so it can lead to what? It can decrease, so it can change the size of thoracic cavity, and finally the so when there is any pathology, so it can lead to the disturb the size of thoracic cavity. Then posture, sitting, sitting position, resting position, walking position, have different position change its posture because sometimes the cardiac patient or pulmonary embolism, pulmonary infusion patient will not take breathing in the supine position. They are taking breathing very well and they're in the sitting position. So this is the how the posture influence the vital capacity. Then there is the functional residual capacity, the amount of air at the end of normal respiration. Residual volume means what? After forceful expansion. But functional residual capacity means what? Amount of air at the end of normal respiration. And what's the total lung capacity? The sum of all four lungs volume. The total volume of a lung that a lung can do. The total lung capacity, uh, the combination of vital capacity and residual volume. The combination of vital capacity and residual volume called total lung capacity. Now I talk about the pul- pulmonary capacity. What's the alveolar ventilation? That the volume of inspired air that reaches the alveoli. Actually, alveolar ventilation means what? That the connection between the alveoli and external environment. When you inspire the air, you are taking oxygen from the environment into the alveoli, and when you are doing expiration, you are releasing the carbon dioxide to the environment. So this is how the alveolar ventilation means. What's the anatomical dead space? That the air in the passageway, like in the bronchi or in the trachea, they do not participate in gas exchange. because when you inspire the air, not all the air can take place in gas exchanges. Some remain in the anatomical dead space, and some air can take place in gas exchanges. And what's the physiological dead space? That the anatomical dead space, that this one plus the volume of any non-functioning alveoli, plus the volume of, if there is a non-functioning alveoli, so the dead space plus non-functioning alveoli we call what physiological dead space. That is in the pulmonary diseases like pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis. This can happen. Alveoli must be properly ventilated for adequate gas exchanges. So alveoli must be good, right? Because when when the alveoli diameter increases, their pressure decreases. When alveoli diameter decrease, their pressure increases. So this is very important thing. What's the pulmonary gas exchanges? Now here, that the how gas exchanges take place between blood and alveoli. Again, listen. That how the gas exchanges happen between the alveoli and blood. So exchanges of gases take place between the alveolar air and through the capillaries, because blood flow through lungs capillary. So between alveoli and capillary. So this is the two compartments how the gas exchange take place. There is a four factors that determine the amount of oxygen that diffuse into blood. The first factor is what? Oxygen pressure gradient between alveolar air and blood. Very important thing. When the Because when the capillary in the when in the alveoli, when pressure become high, oxygen pressure in the alveoli become high, then the capillaries, of course, ventilation happen. So oxygen diffuse. This is the definition of a diffusion. Okay. So that oxygen diffuse from the alveoli from high concentration to the low concentration to the capillary. Then there is a total functioning surface area of respiratory membrane. It's very also important that if the total functional area of the respiratory membrane, like in the interstitial lung disease or in the bronchiectasis, in the any injury to the respiratory membrane, I will discuss in my next PPT what is the respiratory membrane. So when the total lung capacity, I just this, for example, this is the alveoli, this is the fluid and surfactant layer, this is what, this is your respiratory uh, alveoli, and this is the interstitial space, and this is your capillary endothelium, capillary, this is we call what, capillary basement membrane, and this is the capillary endothelium. So this is a this is a capillary, this is the capillary basement membrane, and this is the capillary endothelium, and this is the capillary. And this is see how diffusion happen. In the alveoli, oxygen pressure become high. In the red blood cells, capillary, oxygen pressure less. So how diffusion happen from high concentration to the low concentration. Then in the red blood cells, carbon dioxide become high. Then how it diffuse from the high concentration to the low concentration. This is how gas exchanges take. So if any pathology like interstitial space, there is an interstitial lung disease, so this become thick, dry, fibrous. So proper ventilation, proper gas exchange will be not. Okay, this is very important thing. Then respiratory minute volume, that how much you inspire the volume in 1 minute, and alveolar ventilation. Then what's the structural factor that facilitate oxygen diffusion, that already talk about the wall of alveoli and capillary formerly only a very thin barrier to fall, because if I should, this is a very thin layer. It's look like a thick, but in reality this is a very thin layer. This is the surfactant, that this is your type pneumocyte that produce surfactant that can maintain the surface tension. So This is a very thin layer. From this, there's how the gas exchanges take place. And the alveolar and capillary surface area are larger. When larger, division easily happen, and blood is distributed through the capillary, the thin layer, and each red blood cells come close to the air. This is very important because when you take the oxygen, when oxygen pressure is high, if red blood cell is not here, if here is a red blood cell, see, here is red blood cells, here is oxygen. It will not diffuse. It will not take, red blood cell will not take properly oxygen. Red blood cell must be in a proper position just to take the oxygen very quickly, like this, very quickly, just to maintain the oxygen. And then how blood transported gases. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are the form of what? The transport of oxygen. You know that hemoglobin is made up of four polypeptide chain, two alpha and two beta chain. So each within iron containing heme group. So carbon dioxide bind to the amino acid in the chain and oxygen can bind to the iron in the heme group. So oxygenated blood contain about 0.3 ml of dissolved oxygen per 100 ml of blood. But hemoglobin increases the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. So oxygen travels in two forms, as in dissolved oxygen in plasma, this one, and associated with hemoglobin, this one. So increasing blood partial when in the blood partial pressure of oxygen increase, so it accelerates the hemoglobin that you can bind with oxygen. When this pressure becomes increased, like this pressure is this one, okay. So when increasing partial pressure of oxygen increases, so it can accelerate the hemoglobin that you can bind oxygen. So oxyhemoglobin carries the majority of total oxygen transported by the blood. That hemoglobin take the maximum of the oxygen to deliver to the tissue. This is a dissolve. Oxygen blood contain the dissolve. This dissolve can produce a partial pressure of oxygen. And how the carbon dioxide is transported. So the small amount of carbon dioxide is dissolved in plasma and transported as solute, and less than one-fourth of blood carbon dioxide combined with amine group of hemoglobin and other protein to form carbo carbaminohemoglobin. In the previous all oxygen, mostly 80 to 90% oxygen bind with hemoglobin, but here 20% carbon dioxide combined with hemoglobin and transported. So hemoglobin play a very important role because hemoglobin is the one which can maintain the buffer solution or act as a buffer just to maintain the pH of the red blood cell, not it make RBC so much acidic, not make RBC so much basic. Carbon dioxide is acidic, that's why. So carbon dioxide 10% in the dissolved and is a solute, and 20% is combined with hemoglobin and then it's to form the carbamino group. The carbon dioxide associated with hemoglobin is accelerated by increasing blood carbon dioxide. Here, this is a blood. So this maintain the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So this small amount of carbon dioxide accelerate the carbon dioxide to bind with hemoglobin. So this can play a role in the reaction. And more than two-thirds of the carbon dioxide is carbon. So 70% carbon dioxide transported to the lungs as in the bicarbonate form, and 20% in one in the amine group. 10% in dissolved. What's the systemic gases exchanges? Now this is that how the exchanges of gases in the tissue take place, because cells and tissue, how the exchanges take place. So exchanges take place between the arterial blood that flow through tissue capillaries and cells, because the gas exchange take place between cells and capillaries, because arterioles and with capillaries, then venules, then vein. So this is how the blood circuit is formed. So tissue, outside the tissue, what is capillary? So capillaries is also come from arterial blood. So artery and capillary. So exchanges of gases in tissue take place between arterial blood that flow through the capillaries and cell. So oxygen diffuse out of arterial blood because oxygen pressure gradient favors outward diffusion. So this is how that the exchanges take place. So when has the dissolved oxygen diffuse out of arterial blood, ox- blood oxygen decrease, so which accelerate oxyhemoglobin dissociate to release more oxygen to plasma for diffusion to the cell. So this is how dissolved oxygen take place. And and this is a regulation of pulmonary ventilation, that how regulation of pulmonary ventilation happen. So respiratory control now, and this is an, so I just would like to talk about the respiratory center. The respiratory control center is a main integrated center that control the nerves that affect inspiratory and expiratory muscle are located in the brainstem. Okay, that the I will show you medullary rhythmic center. It generates the basic rhythms and of respiratory cycle. So the in the medullary region there is a two inspiration. These area consists of two interconnected control centers. Inspiratory center stimulate inspiration. Expiratory center stimulate expiration. I will show you. This is how the respiratory system is controlling. This is a brain. You can see in the detail. This is a pons. This is a midbrain. This is a medulla oblongata. These two are we call pontine respiratory group. One is we call pneumotaxic center, other is we call agnostic center. Pneumo, you can say blow out the air. Pneumo mean air, taxic mean just remember like that is a air blowing. And then there is a ventral respiratory group and medulla. See, first of all, I talked about the agnostic center. It's we call agnostic center cause inspiration. Agnostic center in the form give positive message to the dorsal respiratory group. So when they give positive message to the dorsal respiratory group, then dorsal respiratory group act on intercostal muscles as well as diaphragm. When it act on diaphragm, it cause what contraction of diaphragm. When it act on external intercostal muscle, it can cause stretching of the thoracic. So of these two action produce what increased thoracic pressure as well as cause contraction of diaphragm. So this is how inspiration takes place. This is due to what dorsal respiratory group. Dorsal respiratory group, you also say that it's an inspiratory group. So this agnostic center lead to the what inspiratory group, inspiratory muscles. This is the inspiration. Now I'll talk about expiratory. The expiratory pneumotaxic. Pneumotaxic center inhibit this center, agnostic center, and as well as it inhibit this dorsal respiratory group, but it stimulates the ventral respiratory group. Pneumotaxic not directly stimulate this. It indirectly stimulate ventral respiratory group. Pneumotaxic firstly inhibit this center, agnostic center to inhibit inspiration, then it inhibit this one, and then it stimulate ventral respiratory group, and then ventral respiratory group go into the muscles, the intercostal muscle that cause expiration, and accessory respiratory muscle that cause expiration. Okay. So the respiratory group, you can say here that the input from agnostic center, when the input from agnostic center in the pons, when the message comes from the agnostic center in the pons, stimulate respiratory center to increase the length and depth of inspiration. What's the pneumotaxic center? Pneumotaxic center in pons inhibits agnostic center and inspiratory center to prevent our inflation of lung. So this is how the normal respiratory system, how the brain control our respiratory system. So that's all about the basic respiratory physiology. So I hope you guys understand very well. So in our next lecture, then I will start respiratory medicine about about diseases like asthma, COPD, and bronchitis. So I will start this because this is very important to tell you, because without this you will never understand about the respiratory medicine very well. So that's all for now. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much.